Hello, everyone in Wimberley, Texas. We wish we could be there with you today, but unfortunately, that's just not possible. But we're so excited about the launch of the Texas Hub and everything that Chad and Rona and Don and Debbie are going to do out there in the region. We get a lot of requests for Allan Savory to come speak in person at events, and unfortunately, in this case, it just wasn't possible to get him there physically. We can't always put him in a plane and get him to all the places that he's requested to be at. So we're trying something new today where he's going to present to y'all digitally, and then we'll have him available afterwards for a live Q&A session. So without further ado, here's the one and only Allan Savory.
Thank you, Chris. This is a little bit strange for me. We're trying something new, but welcome to all of you, and glad to join you, even if it's in this manner over the internet. I actually feel very uncomfortable talking to a computer and not seeing all of you and being able to interact with you, but I'll do my best. I'd also like, before I begin, to thank profusely Katie and Taylor from EPIC for sponsoring your conference, your meeting, and making this possible. Now, what I'd like to do is to get one main point over as firmly as I can. And that point, I'll tell you right up front, is I want to explain to you how tremendously important and vital what you're doing in forming one of the hubs in the Savory Institute global network of hubs is for you, your family, your community, your nation, for all of humanity. Frankly, it is more important than any service you could render, whether military, political, or any others. Now, that's pretty deep stuff. So let's look at why I'm saying that. And now I need to share my screen with you if I can get this right. After Chris's coaching, that seems to be working. You will recall in the TED talk that I gave that went viral that I showed broadly the regions of the world where desertification is occurring, whether the rainfall is an inch of rain or 20 or 30, 40, 50 inches or 80 inches of rain. These are essentially the areas where it is seasonal, and you can see that it covers a major part of the United States, as well as, of course, the most problematic region of the world that is desertifying. Now, the symptoms of desertification are many. Let me cover them briefly. Increasing severity and frequency of droughts and floods, poverty and social breakdown, emigration to cities and across borders that we see affecting changing the political face of Europe and affecting the United States greatly. Destruction of our cultures, as we see with the dying Western ranching culture in the United States, biodiversity loss, of course, and violence and recruitment to problematic dissident organizations. It's one of the biggest factors in guerrilla warfare, is trying to stop that recruitment, but it's being exacerbated everywhere by desertification. And of course, it leads to climate change. Now, put together, these are a greater threat, frankly, to humanity than all the wars ever fought. So you can see what we're dealing with. Now, I want to recount to you a discussion I had with Jim Tier, a very respected Texan. And Jim and I met up 34 years ago one day on King Ranch. I'd never worked with Jim when he was in Africa. I'd heard a lot about him, and I found him a charming man. But he made a strange statement to me, which went along these lines. Allan, either you are wrong, and we will not be able to dig a hole deep enough to bury you in, or you are right, and the world will not be able to build a monument high enough. My reply to that was, Jim, it is not about me, and I don't give a damn what you do with me. What do you think? Jim's reply was, I'm sitting on the fence. Don't you die sitting on the fence like Jim did. Now, if we're going to bring about change, it requires leadership. And when I'm talking about change in this sense, it is change to something that is new and counterintuitive. They use that term paradigm shifting, which I don't like. That sort of change can never come from politicians, and yet people constantly are calling for the politicians to lead. They cannot. It cannot come from any organization, be it a university, environmental, or a cattleman's organization. Organizations oppose and ridicule until public opinion shifts. This is why not a single cattleman's organization in the United States has yet supported my work. They're not being bad, nobody's being evil. This is exactly how organizations function in what are called one of the wicked problems of human organizations, soft, complex systems. Now, that means leadership can only come from ordinary people. That's citizens like yourselves leading as only you can. And only when public view shifts about livestock and management can organizations shift. Thankfully, that shift is just beginning to happen after 50 odd years. And there's not a single case I can find in the history of the world where it's ever been any different when new counterintuitive insights arose. Right, so if you're going to have to lead, as you are now undertaking, we need to look at what we're facing. Most blamed for climate change by all scientists, universities, people, major environmental organizations are livestock or coal and oil. Now, these are resources which we're going to need for centuries to come, both livestock and coal and oil. And resources cannot ever be to blame for what management is doing. Management is the problem, not the resources. Now, management on ranches, that means management of livestock on ranches and in feedlots, how they've been run for thousands of years and how they're run today. And it means the management that chooses to call coal and oil fossil fuels and burn them at a rapid rate. So management is what we're going to have to lead in. Now, there are two vital concepts that we're going to have to get over to the world. One is livestock are essential to address global desertification and climate change, as I explained in TED Talk and many talks. It's not, in my view, adequate if you're trying to lead to be what we used to call mealy-mouthed about it and say livestock can address global climate change. Only livestock can, and we need to be frank about that. Otherwise, people believe there are other alternatives, and livestock is one of them. There are no other alternatives, as has been explained often. And then the second concept we need to get over is that policy needs to be holistic and no longer reductionist. I'll explain this as we go. Now let's look at climate change and the sources of that. And I've just abbreviated it here, but it's the 4 pollutants: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and black carbon, and its desertification. And roughly 50-50% of these are coming from fossil fuels or from agriculture. I'm saying roughly 50% because there aren't good figures. My own view is probably most of it is coming from agriculture. Right now, if we look at what we can stop adding to the atmosphere with all the tools available to science, we've got technology, we've got fire, and we've got resting the land or conservation. And then we can, of course, use technology to plant grasses, trees, shrubs, etc. Now, if we concentrate on those, what can we stop without livestock? And the answer is the 4 pollutants coming from fossil fuels. And only technology can solve that problem. And thankfully, many people are aware of this. Many good organizations are investing a great deal of money in that. Now, let's look at desertification. It's continuing, and all the contribution from soil destruction is continuing, so climate change will continue. No question of that. If we look at what we can stop adding to the atmosphere of the pollutants and so on, if we simply add livestock properly managed to our toolbox, we now find we can deal with all of it. Now, let's look at another aspect of this. If we take the excess of atmospheric pollutants already in the atmosphere and think about where we can deposit them safely, we've got the oceans, but they're already acidifying. That's not really going to work. We can use technology to plant trees, as many people are advocating, and it's even getting Nobel Prizes and so on. But trees have, let's say, roughly 100-year. They're part of the ambient carbon cycle. That'll return. They do not hold the carbon for centuries, so that's not going to work. So we're left with the soil. Now, looking at the soil as the place to deposit most of these pollutants, and looking at if we use the technology we have, the fire and the rest, the free tools available to science, how much can we store safely in the soil? And the answer is nothing, without great risk of it breaking out, coming out in some form at a later point. Now, if once more we add livestock to our toolbox, now what can we safely deal with and store in the soil? And it becomes the whole lot. So if we summarize this, without livestock, continuing as we are, and as literally hundreds of celebrities who are pouring their money into things like vegetarian movements, if we take that line, we can stop roughly 50% of the additions to the atmosphere, and there's nothing else we can do using technology. If we add livestock, all of it now becomes possible. So I think from that you can see why it's desperately serious that we get this over to the public, this role of livestock, so that our institutions can begin to change. So when we look at the role of livestock, I'd like to point out to you that not a single scientist over roughly 50 years now has shown where our logic or science is flawed. I've appealed to scientists to do this over and over. None have. Now, when I first realized in the 1960s, roughly mid-1960s, that we were going to have to use livestock and that I had been wrong and all the work I'd done up to that point, essentially, the problem was how to do it. Nobody had any idea how we might do that. So let's look at that for a moment. If we're going to deal with desertification and use livestock that we've vilified for centuries, in fact, how are we going to do it? As I mentioned in the TED Talk, we'd had about 10,000 years of pastoralists who were extremely knowledgeable. Their whole cultures tied to their livestock, and they had been mob grazing, group grazing, whatever you like to call it, but bunching their animals and moving them frequently. And that had caused the great biblical deserts of the world, and it is still causing desertification in every pastoralist culture that I've been able to look at on the ground. So that clearly wasn't going to work. And then we'd had roughly 100 years of range science, as it's called, and that had accelerated desertification. I first picked this up in Africa and then confirmed it here. And as we see in this picture here of public land in the United States, under all of our US-based range science knowledge. So what were we to do? All grazing systems, rotational grazing systems, use of fencing, herding, all had led to desertification. What would you do? That was the dilemma I faced. And as you know, because many of you know the story, the key to this was complexity. Now, I'm not going to give a long talk on complexity, but let me just point this out, that nothing we make involves complexity. Right up to space exploration vehicles, making alternative energy from solar panels or wind power. Anything we make involves technology, expertise, but by definition is not complex. These are what are called complicated hard systems in system science. Now, everything we manage, from our families to our religions to oceans to agriculture, forestry, wildlife, everything we manage is by definition complex. And that means both our organizations and nature, as we're trying to do. And everything in management involves a web of social, cultural, economic, and environmental complexity that simply cannot be ignored. Now, when we think of that, I want to do a little simple test with you now, and I'll have to rely on your honesty because I can't see you all. This is slightly complicated. It's not complex, but it will give you an idea of the limitations of our minds. So I just want you to count the dots. I'm going to give you plenty of time, and just do that for me, please. Now, I believe all of you probably counted 11 dots. Well done. That was terribly simple. Now let's do it again, but just add one more dimension. So count the dots and the crosses for me, please. I'll give you about the same amount of time. Did you all get 14 dots and 11 crosses? I wish I could get you to show your hands. I believe some of you will have made mistakes at that point, and a few of you might have got that. Now that's incredibly simple, just two things in one dimension. So we'll do it one more time, and I'll give you even more time now. So now I want you to count the dots, the crosses, and the zeros. Are you ready? Now, hold up your hands, the liars who got all right. I doubt any of you did. If you did, you are truly amazing. Now that, as I said, was a very simple exercise. Now think about what you're doing on a ranch with livestock. You've got to worry about the future weather, the past weather, the program, the breeding programs you've got, the types of livestock you're running, the number of herds you're running, the wildlife on the land, the other land uses. You've got a great many things, and yet people continually try to do that in their heads. This is what people tried to do for 10,000 years, and it didn't work. So we had to come up with some alternative. And again, knowing the story, you will all remember that I said I looked at other professions to see who, if anybody, had dealt with anything as complex as this. And logically, I looked at the military, and I literally simply took 300 or more years of European military experience embodied in the British Army and the Rhodesian Army, which we were all using, and I took our simple, immediate battlefield planning procedures and just cribbed them straight out. And I didn't have to improve anything in that technique. All I had to do was to find out a way of expressing something that went on longer than a short battle, because ranchers have to plan for a year, sometimes more than that, ahead of time, and that became logical and easy by just putting it on a chart. And we have to plan on a chart, because you can express 4 dimensions on a chart and many, many factors in them. So that became what is today holistic planned grazing. And that word holistic is terribly critical, because that's where we embody the culture, the economy, everything. That's where we decide if we should even be running livestock. Because if we were beginning to manage holistically in a tropical forest in Brazil or something, and clearing forest to plant pastures for grass, we wouldn't go further than that. Once we made that decision, we would realize it wasn't in our self-interest of our families, our nation, anything else. We wouldn't do it. Likewise, if we were a family or a ranching business putting livestock into feedlots. We ideally should not be doing that because it is so culturally unsound, economically unsound, socially unsound. It is doing such damage. So the word holistic is very key to it, the decision-making part of the planning. All right, now, what happens when new thinking emerges? This puzzled us a great deal. When we first started trying to spread this to people around the world, and first in Africa, then here, we couldn't understand what was happening. I couldn't until I studied the work of Everett Rogers. Everett lived in Albuquerque, so I got to actually meet him as well. And he wrote the book, The Diffusion of Innovations, which went into 3 editions. What Everett explained is that when something truly new comes up, people learn about it from someone else, and then they have to give it a new name and a twist of their own as they vie for recognition. This is really about our egos. And we do this, and it's absolutely normal. Nobody's being bad. It's just how humans behave. Now, when for thousands of years we could not fly, and thousands of men died learning or trying to learn, on a given day, the Wright brothers flew. We'd got the principles of flight. Thankfully, the principles of flight could not be imitated or twisted in any way. And as a consequence, we could release human creativity. Thousands of models of planes were developed as creatively as people could, planes and then rockets, etc. All that didn't follow the principles crashed and didn't mislead anybody. And within 70 years, we were on the moon. Now, we've had thousands of years of desertification and climate change building up. We got the principles of planned grazing with, as I said, over 3 centuries of experience behind it in planning complicated situations, built into it the complexity of social and cultural. We got something working by 1984, working consistently, and imitation has stalled progress, endangering humanity, desertification and climate change continuing. This is where a major part of our problem lies. And again, I stress, nobody is being bad. Most people are good. Most people are doing their best. This is just how we behave. Now, before we let what today is holistic planned grazing loose, we did a trial which I did not call a trial because we were trying to cause failure. We called it an advanced project. We actually did 2 of them in what was then Rhodesia. And in the one in low rainfall, we took 4,000 acres of the very worst land we could find in the nation. I offered a £5 note if anybody could find a single perennial grass growing in a 100-mile drive. It was very bad indeed, as bad as anything I've dealt with. Now, on that, we put in a radial layout of fencing because I wanted to test that, and we doubled the livestock immediately with the planned grazing. I proved wrong. We went to 3 times the stocking rate, and we produced solid perennial grassland. No range science, no other thing except the holistic planned grazing and using the cattle hooves to get the plants growing and not overgrazing plants. That ran for 8 years, regardless, just getting better and better. Now, we were in a long civil war, and I was forced out into exile, and it was 4 years till I could come back, and this is what I found. Total collapse, all livestock removed. 100% overgrazing of the plants, and that was entirely due to dropping the planning process, which was only about 2 hours work a year. That was dropped in favor of the same managers, exact same people, and very good, very observant people, just shifting to a simple rotation. I can't give a louder warning than that. Now, these imitations that cause us so much problem, those began long ago. The first I knew of was this, published in 1978 in Texas. And what had happened was a student from one of the Texas universities was coming over to Rhodesia quite regularly, and with rancher friends of his, he was staying, and I took him around and showed him all we were doing, and he was reporting back, and to his horror, the work was being plagiarized, probably believing an obscure scientist from a little country in Africa would never come here. But when I arrived in the United States 2 years after this, this is what I was shown, was that our work had been developed here. Now, what is puzzling about that is the plagiarized concept was 100% scientifically supported, academic support, but the original immediately got into academic opposition, which hasn't died down. Not all academics are like that, but enough to do tremendous damage. Holistic planned grazing, after we began training over 10,000 people in the United States, almost immediately, within 6 months, had become many different things. And I've just listed some here, so you can see. Now, all of these, unfortunately, fail to address complexity. So all of those are like planes that didn't have the principle of flight, but they cause delay, confusion, establish that holistic plan grazing doesn't work, etc. And you're familiar with the confusion. All right, so let's leave the grazing side of things and how important your job is to keep the knowledge developing, keep to the principles, and maintain the quality of the work as you proceed. Now, the other aspect that is so vital for all of us is policies, because if we're going to succeed in saving humanity and civilization as we know it against global desertification and climate change, it has to be at two levels. That's unarguable. It has to be people at the ground level managing holistically, whether it's wildlife or forestries or cropping or anything else. At the end of the day, the management needs to be holistic to address the complexity. And then we need to have that supported by policies from above that support it and do not force people, as today is happening, to do the wrong things, because that becomes a hopeless mess, as we see. So in the framework, when we use the holistic framework and policy, what can I tell you about it? All I can say to you is repeat stuff that's in our textbook and in the latest edition, is that when I came into the United States, it was in that category of scientists that have special knowledge that America needs. I was given my strongest support from the state of Texas, and tragically, the strongest opposition came from the same state. But within a short while, far-sighted officials in the USDA had engaged me over a 2-year period to put many people through training. We put roughly 2,000 professional people through a week of training over 2 years to use the holistic framework, amongst other things, to analyze and look at policies, how policies could be developed. These people came from the old Soil Conservation Service, now the NRCS, the BLM, US Forest Service, US Fish and Wildlife, BIA. They came faculty members of the great and good land-grant universities, and from the World Bank and USAID. Now, they looked at literally hundreds of their own policies right across the board. They could not find one policy that was likely to succeed, and all they concluded were likely to lead to unintended consequences. And one group in training had a rather long discussion on this, and they now wrote down a statement that we all recorded, and that was, we now recognize that unsound resource management is universal in the United States. I don't have to stress to you how serious that is, with the billions of dollars being spent on policies that frankly have no hope of success. We need to change that. And what was exciting was that good people with lots of knowledge, as those had, way more knowledge than I possess, were able to make these sort of conclusions in just 1 week of training. So what does reductionist policy mean? I get people saying to me, actually reacting with anger and saying, how can you call our policies reductionist? We have integrated scientific teams. We're fully aware that there's social consequences, economic, environmental consequences. How can you call that reductionist? Well, yes, this is true. We do put together integrated teams of amazingly knowledgeable people. But what they do, and it's universal, is they reduce that web of complexity to the problem as the reason or context for the policy. That is reductionist. And that led economists, half jokingly, to refer to the law of unintended consequences, because it is so common. And you'll see this right across the board, whether it's the war on drugs, which is increased drugs, spread violence, increased drug use in America, spread violence across our borders, the war on terror, which is spreading it, the war on weeds, which I'm told costs $1 billion a year. We haven't killed a single weed in a single state, but we keep doing it. The immigration policy, desertification, it doesn't matter what you look at. It is universal that we only develop policies to address a problem, and always we reduce that web of complexity to the problem as the context. That simply is not working, has never worked well, and never will. Now, the alternative to that is to have a simple, single, holistic context for all policies. Generic one or a real one, I'm not going to go into a long lecture on it, but we need a holistic context of how people want their lives to be, tied to their life-supporting environment and behaviors, and then we go about developing a policy to address whatever particular problem it is, but not with the problem as the context. The context is now the holistic context, and then we use 7 context checks just to make sure that our actions are scientifically the best we can do, in every way the best we can do, and they are absolutely in line with the holistic context. And that, with the same knowledge, the same people, gives you totally different results. That's what we need to get the public opinion in favor of doing. Then our institutions can change. So let me conclude the seriousness of it. Global desertification and climate change are incredibly serious. I cannot overstate the seriousness. Leadership can only come from you and the people on either side of you. The hub strategy that you're learning about and becoming involved in is a way of providing citizen leadership. It is the best we have been able to develop. And we've been struggling, many of us, for many years to find some way to spread this knowledge throughout society and practice. And this is the best we've been able to develop, and I have high confidence in it. It's not going to be an easy path. It's going to be just blood, sweat, and tears. There is no greater service that you can provide in your life to your family, your community, your nation, or humanity. And I believe that. I truly do. I congratulate you on joining this global network of thousands of people now on 6 continents. Holistic management is the best we have until something is better is developed. We didn't stop with the original Wright brothers plane. We've got incredible planes today. We will have incredible holistic management in the future. And what we've been able to develop to this point will look primitive, hopefully. But it has to be holistic management and policy development, or the future will be grim indeed. So welcome aboard, and thank you for getting off the fence, which I hope you're really going to do seriously. It's been good talking to you, although I cannot see you. So now let's go over to questions. Thank you.